The morning after the iron bolt fell, the palace did not feel like home. It felt like a body reacting to infection. Prince Kael noticed it first in silence, not the respectful quiet of morning, but a heavier silence that pressed into the ears and dulled distant sound. Servants avoided the western wing entirely. Guards stationed near the corridor stood stiffer than usual, their eyes unfocused, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The torches along the walls flickered despite the absence of wind. Even the marble beneath Kael's boots seemed colder, faint cracks spidering along its surface where none had existed before. The fallen bolt had been removed before sunrise. No servant admitted to touching it, yet it was gone. Kael stood once more at the far end of the corridor, staring at the door. The remaining bolts trembled almost imperceptibly, vibrating in rhythm. Slow, patient, deliberate. He could feel it now without placing his hand against the wood. The presence beyond the door was no longer whispering only at night. It lingered constantly, like breath against the back of his thoughts. By midday, the first sign appeared. A tapestry in the great hall, one that depicted King Odrin's glorious victory at the Battle of the Burning Fields, fell from the wall without warning. The golden threads unraveled midair as it collapsed, revealing the bare stone behind it. Courtiers gasped. Priests muttered protective prayers. But what unsettled them most was not the fall itself. It was what had been hidden behind it, etched faintly into the stone wall, as if scratched long ago and deliberately concealed, were symbols no one recognized. Curved lines circling inward, a shape resembling a doorway, and beneath it, a phrase carved in old royal dialect. The bargain remembers. By evening, the palace animals began to react. Horses in the royal stables refused to enter their stalls. Hunting falcons shrieked and battered their wings against their cages. Even the palace hounds growled low in their throats when brought near the western courtyard. The kingdom beyond the walls still looked peaceful. Fields green, skies clear. But inside the palace something ancient had begun to shift. Kael called for the royal archivist. Lady Saris had served 3 generations of rulers. Thin, sharp-eyed, and impossibly calm, she arrived in his private chamber with scrolls already tucked beneath her arm, as if she had expected the summons. "You have seen it," Kael said without greeting. She did not ask what he meant. "Yes." Her honesty unsettled him more than denial would have. "You know about the bargain." It was not a question. Saris hesitated only briefly before responding. Every heir is told not to question the western door, but some of us read what was never meant to survive. She unrolled a brittle parchment across his desk. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably ancient. A private confession from King Odrin himself, not written for the public record, not carved into heroic legend, written in fear. Odrin had described the night of the drought's peak, when desperation drove him to the forbidden corridor. He had described the darkness inside the door, not as evil, but as vast, intelligent, watchful. He had described the agreement, the prosperity that followed, and the decree of silence. But near the end of the confession, the tone changed. "The presence grows," Odrin had written. "It feeds not on blood, but on forgetting. Each generation that refuses to remember strengthens it. Silence nourishes it. One day, the door will not need be opened." Kael's pulse pounded in his ears. "What does it want?" he asked quietly. Saris met his gaze steadily. Continuation. That word lingered between them. Outside, a sudden tremor rippled through the palace walls. Not violent enough to collapse stone, but strong enough to rattle windows and send dust drifting from ceilings. A distant crash echoed from the western wing. They both knew what it was. Another bolt. That night, the palace changed completely. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost crept across window glass, despite the warmth of summer outside. Candles extinguished themselves in synchronized waves, plunging entire corridors into darkness. Guards reported hearing footsteps behind them when no one followed. A maid swore she saw shadows moving independently of the torchlight. By midnight, rumors spread like wildfire. The palace was cursed. Kael ignored the fear. He returned alone to the western corridor. 2 bolts now lay on the floor. The door surface no longer appeared smooth. Subtle lines had begun to form beneath the wood grain, veins, almost stretching outward like something pressing from within. The warmth radiating from it had intensified, and then, for the first time, it spoke without whispering. The voice filled the corridor, not loud, but vast. The bloodline weakens. Kael forced himself to stand firm. The bargain was honored. For 3 centuries, the voice replied, prosperity granted, enemies broken, kingdom preserved. A pause. Now the silence fractures. Kael thought of his father, of the sudden death, of the falling bolts. You're collecting the debt. No, the voice corrected. The debt collects itself. The corridor darkened further as the torches dimmed to near extinction. Kael felt something else then, not threat, but pressure. The sense that reality itself was thinning around the door. You were never meant to inherit ignorance, the voice continued. You were meant to inherit truth. His chest tightened. What truth? A deep vibration pulsed through the wood. That the kingdom was not saved. A final bolt shuddered violently, but did not fall. The voice softened. It was sustained. Suddenly the torches reignited at full brightness. The corridor fell silent. The door stood motionless once more. But Kael understood something now that his ancestors had refused to accept. The presence beyond the door was not rage. It was inevitability. And the palace was not being attacked. It was being prepared. The inspection itself had not been announced publicly, though it had not been entirely unexpected. Records show that Briarwood Plantation had received minor citations in previous years. Structural were in the West Wing, inconsistent tax declarations, irregularities in livestock reporting. None of these were extraordinary. Estates of that size often operated within a margin of ambiguity, particularly in the decades following the war, when oversight mechanisms were still uneven and inconsistently enforced. Yet the inspection conducted in late October that year differed in one critical respect. It included representatives not only from the Agricultural Bureau, but from the State Health Authority. That detail appears only once in the surviving administrative index, and even there is written faintly, almost as an afterthought, a secondary signature beneath the primary inspector's name. The presence of a health official suggests concern beyond property maintenance or financial compliance. It implies assessment of human conditions, sanitation, illness, confinement. It implies that the estate was not merely being audited, but examined. Witnesses who observed the inspector's arrival noted the absence of ceremony. There was no confrontation at the gates. The plantation owner, Thomas Whitaker, met the delegation at the front steps and escorted them inside without visible resistance. Those watching from the yard described the interaction as cordial and measured. No raised voices, no visible agitation. That composure, in hindsight, reads less like innocence and more like calculation. The inspection lasted 2 days. During that time, the inspectors did not confine themselves to the main house. They moved deliberately across the grounds, entering storage barns, outbuildings, and what older maps refer to as the auxiliary quarters near the tree line. These quarters had not appeared in prior county schematics. Their existence was not entirely secret, but neither had they been formally registered as housing structures. They were described later in secondary testimony as temporary accommodations, though they were visible on their floors and walls suggests long-term occupation. It was in these auxiliary quarters that the first irregularities were observed. Accounts reconstructed from partial statements indicate that the health official documented signs of prolonged overcrowding, improvised bedding, insufficient ventilation, limited sanitation facilities. The arrangement of the space implied containment rather than accommodation. Windows were narrow. Some had been boarded from the outside. Locks were present on doors that, according to standard labor housing design, should not have required them. No official report describing these conditions survives. But a ledger entry in the Health Authority's archive references environmental violations of severe character tied to a rural property in the same district on the same date. The property name is omitted. The severity classification is not. Further anomalies emerge in the estate's internal records. Birth registries maintained by the plantation listed fewer dependents than were present during the inspection. Census figures submitted to the county over the previous 5 years did not align with observed occupancy. The discrepancy was not minor. It was structural. Names were missing. Whether those names had never been recorded or had been deliberately removed remains uncertain. But the absence was noted. The clerk accompanying the inspectors reportedly requested all historical registries dating back 2 decades. That request alone signals that the concern extended beyond current conditions. It suggests a pattern. Financial ledgers, too, displayed inconsistencies. Expenditures allocated for provisions did not correspond to reported labor numbers. Medical supplies were purchased in volumes disproportionate to declared illness rates. There were entries marked special allocation without itemization. In ordinary circumstances, such ambiguities might be dismissed as bookkeeping idiosyncrasies. But within the context of an expanded inspection, they acquired weight. What remains particularly troubling is the absence of arrest records. If the inspectors had uncovered criminal confinement or unlawful labor practices, standard procedure would have required immediate detainment pending investigation. Yet no warrants were issued, no indictments filed. Thomas Whitaker was not prosecuted. Instead, he vacated the property quietly within 48 hours of the order. That sequence implies negotiation. The basement of the main house appears repeatedly in oral accounts gathered decades later, though not officially documented in inspection notes. Because those notes are unavailable, multiple secondary sources refer to restricted access areas below the primary structure. One former groundskeeper, interviewed in old age, described a staircase typically kept locked, leading to a storage space seldom entered. He recalled once being sent to retrieve tools and noticing partitions erected where none had existed previously. The space had been divided into narrow enclosures, each large enough to contain a single occupant. Whether these enclosures were intended for storage, isolation during illness, or confinement cannot be stated definitively, but their existence complicates the narrative of routine agricultural operations. The health authorities' involvement gains additional significance when considering the broader regional context. That year saw outbreaks of fever in nearby counties, though none severe enough to trigger widespread quarantine. Briarwood, however, did not report any such outbreak officially. If illness had been present and concealed, the implications would have extended beyond property violation to public endangerment. Yet again, there were no public health bulletins referencing this state. The crates removed following the inspection likely contained the confiscated ledgers and correspondence. But one witness described a separate set of containers, smaller, sealed tightly, transported under supervision distinct from the clerical materials. The witness could not identify their contents, only that they were not stacked with papers. Speculation regarding these containers has persisted precisely because documentation does not. Another irregularity lies in the estate's burial records. Church registries from the nearest parish list fewer interments than demographic estimates would predict for a property of Briarwood's size over its 50-year operation. Unmarked graves were not uncommon in rural areas, particularly among labor populations. But the scale of discrepancy implied by later analysis suggests more than customary oversight. Ground surveys conducted in the 20th century identified soil disturbances near the auxiliary quarters inconsistent with agricultural use. These findings were never formally published. They exist in field notes preserved privately, referenced only in footnotes of unrelated land assessments. The inspector's demeanor upon departure is described uniformly: restrained, unsmiling, procedural. One observer recalled the health official emerging from the main house pale and silent, declining refreshment offered by the owner. That small refusal, mundane on its surface, has been cited repeatedly in retrospective accounts as emblematic of what had transpired inside. It is important to resist dramatization here. There is no verified evidence of violence witnessed during the inspection, no documented discovery of bodies, no explicit testimony of abuse entered into court record. What exists instead is accumulation of discrepancy, numerical, structural, procedural. Enough irregularity to warrant closure, not enough surviving evidence to narrate conclusively. The phrase "reviewed and resolved," attached to Briarwood's file in state archives, suggests administrative containment rather than criminal prosecution. It indicates that whatever was discovered was addressed through means other than public trial. Such means often involve negotiated forfeiture, property transfer, or quiet dissolution. The classification order applied to Briarwood's records remains the most striking anomaly. Classification implies sensitivity beyond embarrassment. It implies potential instability, political, social, or legal, should the findings become widely known. One plausible interpretation is that the inspection uncovered systemic exploitation extending beyond a single property, arrangements implicating regional authorities or supply networks. Public exposure might have triggered broader inquiry. Containment would have been strategically preferable. Another possibility centers on contagion, an outbreak managed quietly to prevent panic. But the absence of quarantine measures elsewhere undermines that theory. What can be said with certainty is that the inspectors did not treat Briarwood as an ordinary violation. They treated it as something requiring isolation. Isolation not only of space, but of narrative. In subsequent years, attempts to access the confiscated ledgers were denied consistently. Requests submitted by land assessors, legal representatives, and later historians received identical responses citing administrative restriction. The phrase functions as a wall, opaque, impenetrable, devoid of explanation. The auxiliary quarters were dismantled quietly 5 years after closure. Officially, the materials were deemed unsafe due to decay. No photographs survive of their interior. The basement partitions were removed during minor renovations decades later, when the property briefly transferred to a private owner who soon abandoned restoration efforts. That owner left no written account of what he found below. Perhaps the most unsettling detail remains the behavior of those who had lived and worked there. Few spoke publicly. Those who did describe conditions not as overtly violent, but as controlled, regulated, observed. They used words like counted and recorded more often than beaten or threatened. That emphasis suggests a system obsessed with documentation. And with its absence, when the state sealed Briarwood, it did not demolish evidence. It removed it. And removal, unlike destruction, implies preservation for reasons unseen. What the inspectors recorded during those 2 days in October may never surface in full. The paper trail has been reduced to a phrase. The structures have decayed. The participants have died, but the closure remains. Briarwood was not condemned for instability. It was sealed after review, and whatever that review revealed was deemed unfit for public archive. For nearly 8 years after the sealing order, Briarwood Plantation existed in a state of administrative suspension. It was neither condemned nor repurposed. Taxes were paid through an intermediary whose name appears only as initials in county ledgers. The locks placed by the state remain intact, periodically inspected but never removed. Grass overtook the main drive. Paint peeled. Shutters sagged slightly at their hinges. Yet the structure did not collapse. It endured in stillness, preserved less by care than by prohibition. During those years, curiosity dulled into avoidance. Children were warned away not with elaborate ghost stories, but with simple language. The property was not permitted. Farmers who passed along the outer road did not slow their wagons. Even trespassers, common enough in abandoned estates elsewhere, avoided Briarwood. There is a particular deterrent quality to government silence. It suggests consequences undefined. The first recorded unauthorized entry did not occur until the 9th year after closure. The individual responsible was not a vandal, nor a drifter, nor a thrill-seeker. He was a surveyor's assistant named Daniel Hargrove, assigned temporarily to reassess surrounding parcels for potential railway expansion. Hargrove was 26 at the time, literate, methodical, and by all accounts unremarkable. His journal, preserved by descendants and later donated anonymously to a regional archive, contains the only detailed first-person account of the interior of Briarwood following its sealing. The entry is dated May 14th. Hargrove begins clinically. He notes that the state-issued lock on the rear service entrance showed signs of corrosion. He writes that he believed the classification period may have expired, though he admits he did not verify this assumption formally. His tone throughout remains procedural, almost attached, as if aware that emotional language would undermine credibility. He describes the door, resisting briefly, before giving way. The interior, he notes, did not smell of decay. This observation appears repeatedly. He expected rot, infestation, collapse. Instead, he found preservation. Furniture remained in place. Dust layered evenly across surfaces but had not been disturbed. Curtains hung as they had been left. In the dining room, chairs were pushed back slightly from the table, as if occupants had risen without completing a meal. No plates remained, but indentations in the cloth suggested their prior presence. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Hargrove moved slowly, documenting structural integrity for his assignment while recording peripheral impressions almost unwillingly. He notes that the windows had been secured from the inside with wooden braces, installed professionally rather than hastily. He notes that interior doors stood open, except for one at the end of the west corridor. The west corridor does not appear in earlier architectural descriptions of Briarwood. According to Hargrove, the corridor felt narrower than proportion allowed, as though walls had been adjusted inward. He measured informally, counting paces. His count did not align with exterior dimensions. He attributes this discrepancy to possible renovation prior to sealing, but offers no confirmation. The door at the corridor's end was locked. Unlike the exterior seals, this lock bore no state insignia. It appeared older, integrated into the structure itself. Hargrove describes hesitating before attempting entry, not out of fear, but uncertainty regarding purpose. He reminds himself in the journal that his task concerned land measurement, not interior exploration. He attempted the handle anyway. It did not open. Instead of forcing it, he continued his survey downward toward the basement stairs, an architectural feature present in original schematics. He notes that the staircase showed scuffing inconsistent with prolonged vacancy. Dust patterns had been disturbed at some point after sealing, though not recently. The basement air was cooler. Here, Hargrove's language shifts subtly. He writes that the space was subdivided beyond necessity. He counts wooden partitions forming narrow enclosures along the north wall. Each enclosure contained a simple cot frame, iron ring fixed near the baseboard, and a small shelf built at shoulder height. The shelves were empty. He does not speculate in the journal about purpose. He measures. He counts 8 enclosures. He notes that ventilation was minimal, limited to 2 high windows no wider than a hand span. He remarks that drainage appeared insufficient for sustained occupancy by multiple individuals. He writes that the partitions were constructed with care, sanded and aligned evenly. He does not describe blood. He does not describe restraints attached. He describes design. In one enclosure, he found a ledger fragment lodged between floorboards. The fragment contained partial columns, names abbreviated, dates incomplete, numeric tallies without headings. He transcribed what he could before replacing the fragment where he found it. He does not explain why he returned it rather than retaining it as evidence. The most striking portion of his account concerns sound. While in the basement, he reports hearing a noise from above, subtle but distinct, not movement, but resonance, as if a door had shifted slightly within its frame. He pauses, writing at this point in the journal. The next entry resumes an hour later. His tone tightened. He returned upstairs to investigate. The west corridor door, previously locked, now stood ajar. Hargrove does not claim to have seen anyone enter or exit. He does not attribute the change to wind. He simply records the fact. Inside the room beyond the door, he found shelving, floor to ceiling, lined with labeled boxes. The labels had been removed deliberately, leaving rectangular discolorations where paper once adhered. On a central table lay several bound volumes. Their spines bore no titles. He opened one. Its pages had been cut cleanly from the binding. Another volume contained pages, but entire paragraphs had been inked over with dense cross-hatching, not redacted neatly, obscured violently. Hargrove copied one visible heading before closing the book. Supplementary accounting. He does not elaborate. At this point in the journal, his writing becomes compressed, as though conserving space or thought. He states that he experienced a clear awareness that his presence inside the property would not be interpreted as innocent if discovered. He felt observed not by a person, he clarifies, but by structure, by arrangement, by the deliberate preservation of certain elements and removal of others. He exited the house within the hour. He resealed the rear door as best he could. He did not report the entry to his supervisor. Instead, he appended a final observation to his journal weeks later, that Briarwood was not empty when sealed. It had been curated. The distinction matters. Curated implies selection. It implies that inspectors, upon discovering irregularities, chose which artifacts to confiscate and which to leave behind. They removed official ledgers. They removed correspondence. But they left the partitions. They left the architecture confinement intact. Why preserve the structure if destruction would have erased implication? One possibility is evidentiary preservation, maintaining the site for potential future inquiry. Another is deterrence, allowing the sealed estate to function as silent warning. Or perhaps the removal of documentation was deemed sufficient. The physical space without narrative could not testify effectively. Hargrove's journal ends abruptly that summer. No further references to Briarwood appear in his surviving writings. He married 2 years later, relocated west, and died at middle age from causes unrelated to his work. His descendants reported that he rarely spoke of his surveying years. The state did not respond publicly to rumors of trespass. The classification order remained active. The railway expansion bypassed the property entirely. Rerouted without explanation, though original maps indicate Briarwood sat along the most efficient line. Avoidance layered upon avoidance. What remains, then, is a house preserved not by reverence but by restraint. A basement subdivided beyond necessity. Shelves of volumes stripped of language. Locks placed both by the state and before it. The unauthorized entry did not expose a singular atrocity. It exposed design, and design suggests duration. Briarwood was not sealed in panic. It was sealed after recognition. Recognition of what, precisely, remains absent from surviving archive. But absence, when structured repeatedly across decades, forms its own outline. In the next part, we will examine the quiet transfer of ownership that followed, the intermediary who paid taxes without claiming residence, and the brief reopening attempt that ended as abruptly as the first inspection. The transfer of Briarwood Plantation did not occur through auction. There was no public notice of foreclosure, no advertisement of distressed property, no competitive bidding as was customary when estates fell into disuse. Instead, ownership shifted quietly 2 years after the sealing order through an instrument filed in the county registrar's office under a limited liability holding designation that did not exist elsewhere in regional records. The name of the holding entity was procedural, indistinct, comprised of initials and a geographic reference too broad to be meaningful. Its listed representative was not Thomas Whitaker, nor any known member of his family. The representative was an intermediary. His name appears in tax documents for 7 consecutive years following the closure. He did not reside on the property. He did not list Briarwood as primary holding. He paid annual levies precisely on time. No improvements were declared. No agricultural yield reported. The land, in official terms, generated nothing and required nothing. This arrangement is unusual. Properties of that scale incur costs without output. Maintenance, even minimal, requires oversight. Yet Briarwood's financial trail shows only preservation. No renovation, no resale attempt, no subdivision. The estate existed in suspended equilibrium, funded without benefit. The intermediary, identified in documents as Samuel Corwin, had professional ties not to agriculture but to legal arbitration. He appears in state records as facilitator in disputes involving land acquisition and regulatory compliance. His presence in Briarwood's ownership chain suggests administrative containment rather than commercial interest. Corwin never visited the estate publicly. At least no such visit was recorded. Yet annual inspection signatures confirm that someone authorized access to the grounds for structural review of exterior elements, roof stability, boundary markers, fence lines. These inspections did not extend to interior documentation. The basement partitions remained undisturbed. The west corridor room remained sealed. It is during this period that a secondary development occurred. Subtle, almost peripheral, yet critical. Several former laborers associated with Briarwood relocated within the same 2-year window. Their movements appear coordinated not geographically, but temporally. Families that had remained in proximity following the closure dispersed to counties separated by significant distance. Some secured employment in industries unrelated to agriculture, textile mills, river transport, small manufacturing. Their relocation records show assistance stipends issued by a state relief office. These stipends were modest, but their origin raises questions. Relief funds were typically allocated in response to natural disaster, economic collapse, or public health crisis. No such crisis was declared for Briarwood, yet stipends were issued. The dispersal of former laborers reduces the likelihood of collective testimony. Fragmentation functions as deterrent. Meanwhile, the Whitaker family reestablished residence in a northern district known for industrial expansion. Census data lists Thomas Whitaker as consultant in 2 separate entries over a decade. The term is ambiguous. No industry specified. No company named. He did not face prosecution. He did not face public inquiry. He resumed life with diminished visibility. Back at Briarwood, the landscape continued its slow reclamation. Photographs taken incidentally in the background of unrelated land surveys showed a house increasingly obscured by overgrowth. Vines crept along columns. The main drive narrowed beneath encroaching brush, but structural integrity remained surprisingly intact. Roof lines did not collapse. Windows, though clouded, remained in frame. Preservation without occupation implies intention. In the 7th year following closure, a petition was filed by a regional preservation society requesting access to document the estate's architectural features. The petition cited historical value, referencing the property's antebellum design. The request was denied within 30 days. The denial did not reference classification explicitly. It stated simply that the property was not available for review at this time. No further petitions were filed. The intermediary's tax payments ceased abruptly in the 8th year, not gradually, not delinquently, ceased, yet foreclosure did not follow. Instead, a notation appears in county records indicating state assumption under provisional custody. This phrase appears nowhere else in that decade's registry. Stay assumption without public declaration suggests internal reclassification. It is at this juncture that railway planners rerouted expansion lines away from Briarwood despite initial mapping indicating direct passage. The reroute increased construction cost and lengthened transit time. No engineering impediment is cited in project summaries. Avoidance layered upon avoidance. The basement partitions remained intact through this transition. A maintenance note filed by a contracted roofer, one of the few tradesmen granted limited interior access for structural evaluation, mentions lower-level wooden structures present, not load-bearing. The note is terse. It does not describe purpose. It confirms existence. Years later, when a brief attempt was made to reopen the property under private acquisition, the effort dissolved within months. The purchaser, whose name appears in one transfer document before being struck through in ink, initiated minor restoration, clearing brush, repairing shutters, repainting exterior trim. Local observers recall renewed activity with cautious curiosity. Then, as abruptly as it began, the restoration ceased. Tools were removed, workers dismissed. The purchaser relocated out of state within the year. No public statement explained the reversal. One surviving letter from that purchaser to a business associate references complications discovered in structural review that render continuation impractical. The letter contains no elaboration. It does not specify hazard. It does not mention legality. It uses the word complications. By this time, 3 decades had passed since the original inspection. Those directly involved were aging or deceased. Collective memory softened, yet administrative containment persisted. The question arises, if the initial inspection uncovered violations severe enough to warrant sealing and classification, why preserve the structure at all? Why not demolish and erase? Demolition destroys narrative but invites suspicion. Preservation neutralizes without spectacle. A standing structure suggests patience. It suggests that whatever was discovered did not require immediate eradication, only controlled obscurity. In reviewing archive correspondence between state offices during this era, one memorandum surfaces with ambiguous relevance. It discusses properties of sensitive administrative character requiring restricted custodial oversight pending generational attenuation. The phrase generational attenuation implies passage of time sufficient to diminish living memory. Briarwood fits this description. By maintaining silence and dispersing associated individuals, The state allowed memory to fragment naturally. The intermediary, Samuel Corwin, died without public connection to Briarwood. Noted in his obituary, his estate papers do not reference the property. If private records existed, they have not surfaced. Thomas Whitaker died earlier, his obituary praising business acumen and civic discretion. The word discretion appears twice. The auxiliary quarters near the tree line, dismantled earlier, left shallow depressions visible in aerial photography decades later. Soil analysis performed unofficially in the 20th century indicated organic disruption consistent with repeated excavation, though conclusions remain unpublished. What lingers most from this period is not dramatic revelation, but pattern withdrawal. Each attempt at access, preservation petition, railway expansion, private restoration, met with quiet redirection, not prohibition with explanation, redirection without one. Administrative language functions as camouflage. Terms like provisional custody, restricted review, structural complication obscure rather than clarify. They create the impression of resolution without disclosing cause. And through this language, Briarwood persisted, not abandoned, not condemned, but withheld. The intermediary period reveals that sealing was not a temporary corrective action. It was the first phase of a long containment strategy. Removal of records, dispersal of labors, reassignment of ownership, avoidance of redevelopment. Each step reinforces intent to minimize exposure rather than pursue justice. Justice would have required transparency. Containment requires patience. By the time generational attenuation had occurred, by the time those who might have testified were gone, the state had become artifact rather than evidence. In the next and final part, we will examine the modern re-examination of Briarwood, the reopening of partial archives, the rediscovery of fragmented ledgers, an emerging interpretation of what the inspection likely uncovered, an interpretation grounded not in spectacle, but in systematic design. The reopening did not begin with Briarwood itself. It began with paper. Nearly 70 years after the original sealing order, a routine state archive reclassification project brought several long-restricted agricultural oversight files back into circulation. Most contained mundane material, inspection summaries, livestock disease tracking, irrigation compliance. Among them was a thin folder labeled only with a district number corresponding geographically to Briarwood's location. The folder did not bear the estate's name. It did not contain a formal report. It contained fragments, a receipt acknowledging transfer of supplementary accounting volumes, a memorandum referencing discrepancies between reported and observed occupancy, a brief notation signed by a health authority official stating, environmental and administrative conditions incompatible with public disclosure pending structured resolution. Structured resolution. The phrase appears only once in the archive. There was no appended explanation of what resolution entailed, no confirmation that it occurred, only acknowledgement that disclosure itself was deemed incompatible. Historians reviewing the folder at first assumed misfiling, but cross-referencing dates and personnel signatures aligned unmistakably with Briarwood's inspection. The absence of the estate's name within the documents, once puzzling, began to appear intentional, erasure through omission rather than destruction. Subsequent inquiry uncovered a separate ledger fragment miscatalogued under unrelated land arbitration files. The fragment matched Daniel Hargrove's journal transcription decades earlier. Columns without headings, abbreviated names, numerical tallies uncontextualized. When examined under magnification, faint impressions were visible beneath the surface ink, as if previous entries had been scraped away and overwritten. Overwriting suggests correction. Scraping suggests concealment. Further examination of burial registries in surrounding parish revealed additional anomalies. While official interments did not reflect unusual mortality rates, adjacent land deeds referenced small plots transferred quietly to the estate under non-standard agreements. These plots were never developed agriculturally. Soil composition analysis conducted much later by independent researchers indicated disturbance layers inconsistent with crop rotation, but consistent with repeated shallow excavation. No definitive conclusion could be drawn, but pattern emerged. The health authority's involvement in the original inspection, previously dismissed as precautionary, gained renewed significance when contemporaneous medical correspondence surfaced. Letters exchanged between regional physicians during that year mention an inquiry into unregistered labor population subject to extended containment under pretext of contractual obligation. The letters do not name Briarwood. They do not describe conditions in detail. They reference ethical discomfort, extended containment. The phrase echoes the basement petitions described in Hargrove's journal. At this stage, modern interpretation must proceed carefully. There is no surviving document explicitly stating that Briarwood operated unlawful confinement beyond post-war labor contracts common in the region. There is no signed confession, no court indictment. What exists instead is convergence. Auxiliary quarters not listed in official schematics. Occupancy discrepancies across multiple years. Basement enclosures designed with durability rather than improvisation. Financial ledgers reflecting supply levels inconsistent with declared workforce. State stipends facilitating labor dispersal after closure. Railway rerouting avoiding the site entirely. Repeated administrative language emphasizing restriction rather than violation. Each element alone could be rationalized. Together, they resist dismissal. The most plausible interpretation emerging from accumulated evidence is not dramatic experimentation nor epidemic catastrophe. It is bureaucratic exploitation refined to administrative invisibility. Briarwood appears to have maintained a secondary population, unregistered, unreported, and confined through contractual ambiguity. Post-war labor systems often blur legality, but confinement structures exceeding standard housing norms suggest something more controlled. Individuals counted but not named, supplied but not acknowledged, contained but not documented. If inspectors uncovered such a system, prosecution would have exposed not only a plantation owner, but potentially regional oversight failures. Contracts sanctioned under ambiguous authority. Health inspections previously waived. Census acceptance of incomplete data. Exposure would have required admission of systemic complicity. Containment required only silence. This interpretation aligns with the absence of arrest. It explains confiscation of ledgers rather than demolition of structures. It clarifies dispersal stipends as preventative measure against coordinated testimony. It contextualizes classification language as protective rather than punitive. Justice would have required public reckoning. Administrative containment preserves stability. In the decades following reclassification, limited archaeological surveys were conducted discreetly at the site, now partially overgrown and structurally unstable. Ground-penetrating scans identified subsurface irregularities near the former auxiliary quarters. Permission for excavation was requested, but denied under heritage protection statutes. Ironically, the property's historical designation now shields it from intrusive investigation. Protection through preservation. The house still stands. Weathered but upright, its columns carry weight not only of architecture, but of unresolved narrative. Visitors can approach the perimeter. They can photograph the facade. They cannot access the basement. The state classification order expired formally years ago, but practical access remains restricted through layered legal ownership and preservation ordinances. The effect is indistinguishable from the original seal. Briarwood endures as controlled absence. Perhaps the most revealing development occurred not through excavation, but genealogy. Descendants of former laborers associated with the estate began cross-referencing oral histories with archival fragments. Stories long dismissed as exaggeration, rooms without windows, counting rituals at dusk, names spoken only in whispers, found subtle corroboration in material evidence. These descendants did not seek spectacle. They sought acknowledgement. Acknowledgement has not been formally granted. The Whitaker lineage, traced through northern records, contains no mention of Briarwood in private correspondence available publicly. Estate inventories following Thomas Whitaker's death list financial instruments, but omit reference to the plantation entirely, as though it had never existed within personal holdings. Erasure operates most effectively when it becomes inherited habit. Modern scholars examining Briarwood resist framing it as singular atrocity. The danger of singular framing lies in isolation, positioning the estate as aberration rather than manifestation. What the fragments suggest is not deviation from systemic practice, but intensification of it beyond acceptable visibility. The inspectors, upon recognizing this intensification, may have faced a calculation: prosecute and destabilize, or seal and disperse. They chose the latter. The sealing order, then, was not declaration of justice. It was mechanism of containment, and containment leaves architecture intact. The basement partitions described by Hargrove were removed eventually during partial renovation attempts, their lumber repurposed or discarded without documentation. The physical evidence of design faded, but the memory of design persists through record fragments and convergent testimony. Briarwood does not reveal horror through spectacle. It reveals it through administration, through columns without headings, through names abbreviated beyond recognition, through stipends issued quietly, through railway lines bent away, through preservation without access. The plantation was sealed not because it was haunted. It was sealed because it functioned too efficiently in ways that could not withstand examination. The records were not released because they implicated more than a single estate. They implied structure, and structures are harder to prosecute than individuals. Today, Briarwood exists as a study in absence. What happens when documentation is curated rather than destroyed, when evidence is removed but architecture remains, when silence becomes policy rather than consequence? Visitors standing at the edge of the overgrown drive may see only decay. They may photograph columns and speak of Southern history in broad terms. Few will consider the possibility that what was sealed inside was not violence in dramatic form, but a system refined enough to avoid language. Language would have demanded response. Silence permitted continuity. The plantation that was sealed by the government was not erased. It was withheld, and withholding, sustained across generations, can be more powerful than destruction. What remains is not confession. It is pattern, and pattern, once recognized, cannot be entirely unseen.